There are nights in Oxford when the snow does not fall so much as it hesitates, drifting sideways, pausing over the domes and spires as if reluctant to settle. I remember one such evening, seated by the window of the King's Arms, the amber of my pint catching the last glow from Radcliffe Square. The streets were emptying, the students long vanished into their heated rooms, and I was left with that familiar company of silence and regret. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, hesitant, mournful, like a man uncertain of his own purpose. The first flake touched the glass beside me. It stayed there, trembling, before melting into a clear drop that ran down to the sill. Through the window, I saw a figure crossing the square, a woman in a red scarf moving briskly beneath the halo of the gas lamps. Her step was too deliberate for a tourist, too solitary for a scholar on term. For a moment I thought she glanced toward the pub, though the distance and the falling snow made that impossible to know. Then she vanished under the archway by the camera, leaving only her footprints pale, temporary hieroglyphs on the darkened cobblestones. I finished my drink more slowly than usual. The barman had switched the radio to something faint and choral. A college choir rehearsing, perhaps, the sound echoing against the stone like a hymn one has half forgotten how to believe. There was a peculiar lightness in the air, as if the city were holding its breath. I paid and stepped outside, the snow already gathering on my shoulders, the square transformed into a dim world of white and shadow. It felt, I thought even then, like standing inside a photograph that would soon fade. The lamplight shivered on the iron railings. A car passed, tires whispering on the snow, and somewhere a clock struck the quarter hour. I remember thinking how strange it was to hear so much quiet, the sort of quiet that feels full rather than empty. At the corner by St. Mary's, a caretaker's torch flickered briefly before disappearing down a side alley. He carried a bucket and a look of resignation, as if even the act of keeping order had become absurd beneath such weather. By the time I reached the camera, the red scarf was gone. Only a single glove lay near the steps, the sort of thing one might lose without noticing a small, soft thing out of place against the stone. I stopped to pick it up, but stopped halfway. There was a dark stain beside it, half covered now by snow. I told myself it could have been anything, mud perhaps, or oil. Yet something in its shape resisted that explanation. I straightened, listening. The city gave no answer. I walked on toward Broad Street, my breath hanging like pale smoke, and I remember a faint unease, not fear exactly, but that quiet knowledge that something somewhere had tilted, just slightly, out of its natural order. A gull cried from the direction of the river, too far inland for comfort. The bells resumed, uncertain in their rhythm, and I found myself counting them as though the number might matter. Later, when Lewis would ask what first drew my attention to the case, I could only say that it began with the snow, that slow, deliberate snow that softened everything it touched, except the one detail that refused to be buried: the glove, the stain, the silence that followed. It was not the first time I'd felt the city whisper its secrets beneath the frost, nor would it be the last. But that night, standing alone in Radcliffe Square, I had the curious sense that the past had stirred, that something, or someone, had stepped quietly out from it, leaving their trace in the whiteness before vanishing into the dark. It was Lewis who first mentioned the article. He read it aloud in that careful way of his, as though testing the weight of each syllable before it could bruise the air. Body found near Radcliffe camera. Police appeal for witnesses. Nothing unusual in that, not for Oxford. The city is full of quiet tragedies, disguised as academic footnotes, but there was something about the phrasing that caught me, a note slightly out of tune. Perhaps it was the poet in me, or the pedant. Either way, I heard the discord before I knew its name. The dead woman, they said, was Dr. Julia Fenwick of St. Bride's College, a visiting lecturer in romantic poetry, newly arrived from Durham, early 40s, unmarried, respected. She had been found at dawn, half buried in the snow near the north steps of the camera. No witnesses, no signs of struggle. The coroner would call it misadventure. Oxford is fond of such tidy euphemisms. Lewis folded the paper and looked at me. He asked, in his plain northern way, whether I knew her. I told him I did not, though even then I had the uneasy sense of recognition, the sort one feels toward a half-remembered line of verse. I asked for the newspaper. He passed it over without comment. The ink had smudged where his thumb had pressed against the margin. It was a small article, 2 paragraphs, but there it was the misquotation. Keats, naturally. Beauty is truth. Truth beauty, the journalist had written, in italics as though reverent. But it was not the line itself that troubled me. It was the punctuation. The comma after truth was missing. A small thing, easily overlooked. Yet I could not help thinking that Julia Fenwick, being a scholar of poetry, would have noticed it too. That single omission felt like an erasure of intent, as though someone had rewritten the smallest piece of meaning. Perhaps that was when the case began for me with a comma adrift in the snow. I went out later, under a sky still bruised with evening, and stood where she had fallen. The square had thawed unevenly. Patches of dirty ice clung to the stones. Tourists passed, indifferent, photographing the camera as though it were a cathedral of knowledge rather than a mausoleum of it. There was no sign of blood now, no glove, nothing but the faint outline of where the police tape had been. Yet I imagined her there, her bright mind suddenly stilled, and felt a quiet anger at the banality of it all. In the police station, Strange was already drafting the report. He said it looked simple enough. Woman slips on ice, head injury, dies instantly. No witnesses, no suspects, no scandal. Lewis nodded, relieved perhaps at the simplicity of it. I said very little. When Strange left to answer a call, I stared at the case file and felt the old disquiet, that unshakable instinct that accidents in Oxford are rarely accidental. I told Lewis to find out who wrote the article. He asked why, and I said I didn't know, which was true, at least then. That night at home, I found myself rereading Keats. The same line, the same poem. I traced the comma with my finger, as though by touching it I might feel what Julia Fenwick had once felt, that frail intersection of truth and beauty, of what is and what ought to be. Outside, the snow began again, soft and unhurried. Somewhere a siren rose, then faded. The city slept on, pretending innocence. But I could not, for I had seen how the smallest alteration of a comma, a gesture, a glance could turn meaning into deceit, and I knew, though I could not yet prove it, that something had been edited not only in print, but in life. St. Bride's has always seemed to me a college half in mourning for itself. Even in sunlight it carries the air of a place abandoned politely, as though the present century had declined to disturb its sleep. On the morning we arrived, the snow had hardened to a grey crust. The quadrangle was soundless, except for the soft hiss of our boots against stone. Lewis remarked that it looked beautiful. I remember thinking that beauty in Oxford is often just the camouflage of guilt. Inside, the porter led us through a cloister that smelled faintly of polish and cold books. The notice board still carried last term's lectures, Milton, Browning, the symbolist legacy. A paper curl at one corner trembled each time a draft found its way under the oak door. I wondered whether Julia Fenwick's name had once been written there in tidier ink before someone took it down. Perhaps the hand that removed it hesitated, unsure how to erase the dead without offending the living. We began with Professor Avery Quentin, to those who wished to flatter him, a tall man whose intellect entered the room before he did. He welcomed us with the slow courtesy of someone accustomed to applause. He spoke of Julia as a promising scholar, slightly naive, inclined to enthusiasm over rigor. The faintest sneer accompanied the word enthusiasm. His eyes drifted to a shelf of first editions behind him, each aligned like a regiment of witnesses. I asked whether he had seen her the night she died. He said no, but his hesitation arrived a beat too late. There is a rhythm to truth, and he had missed it by half a breath. Eleanor Briggs, the bursar, was next thin, deliberate, a woman who measured out her sentences as others do sugar. Her office smelled of dust and lavender. She spoke of college finances, of the responsibility one owes to order and discretion. Julia had been brilliant, she said, but impractical, inclined toward sentiment. I asked what that meant. Briggs lowered her gaze to a stack of ledgers and said nothing. When people repeat the virtues of order, they are usually defending the absence of conscience. Our final call was on Thomas Calder, poet, recluse, the sort of man Oxford manufactures in batches. His rooms overlooked the garden, frozen now, but with a melancholy geometry that suited him. He poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, whether from nerves or drink I could not tell. He said he had loved Julia once, though not in any conventional sense. She was a mirror, he said, and one cannot embrace one's reflection without shattering it. I remember the phrase because it was too polished to be spontaneous. Later, I would find it, almost verbatim, in one of his published collections. As we left, Lewis muttered that they were all very clever people who seemed to know nothing. I told him cleverness was often the quickest route to ignorance. In the quadrangle, a blackbird pecked at the ice near the fountain. A small thing, easily overlooked, but it struck me that its feathers were slick with something darker than water. I bent down and the stain was faint but distinct. Rust, perhaps, or blood diluted by snow. Lewis frowned, impatient to return to warmth. I said nothing, but the thought lingered like a half-remembered line of verse. That night I sat in my flat, the scent of old paper still clinging to my coat. I wrote the 3 names in my notebook, Avery, Briggs, Calder, and beneath them a single word motive. Then, for no reason I could explain, I added another ghost. Because that was what St. Bride's felt full of, not the clattering kind that haunts the corridors of imagination, but the quieter sort that lives in memory, in envy, in the polished surface of a life too carefully arranged. I poured a small measure of whiskey, watched the amber catch the light, and thought again of the blackbird's wings glistening like ink. In Oxford, nothing stains without leaving a meaning. It was Lewis who found it, though he would later insist that I had somehow led him to it without saying a word. The library at St. Bride's was a long, echoing corridor of quiet gilt, where even the dust seemed to have its own hierarchy. We had gone there to look through Julia Fenwick's papers, the ones she had been revising for her last lecture. I remember thinking that libraries are the closest thing Oxford has to graveyards. Only the dead here are bound in cloth and Latin. Lewis called softly from the poetry section. He was holding an old copy of Donne, the 1923 Oxford edition, spine cracked, the kind of book that has been opened too often by people looking for confirmation of something they already fear. Between the pages, folded twice and pressed flat by time, lay the I letter. No envelope, no signature, just a single sheet of college stationery, faintly scented with something floral that had long since lost its name. I read it once in silence. It was brief, little more than a warning. It spoke of an arrangement, a sum of money, and a promise that must never reach the bursar's eyes. I felt Lewis watching me, waiting for the inevitable explanation. I told him it might be nothing. That was a lie, and he knew it. The handwriting was elegant but uncertain, the ink thinning toward the end as though written in haste. I noticed the slant of the T's, the precise loop of the G's. It was a woman's hand, educated, but not Julia's. She wrote with a leftward lean. This one fell forward, restless. I slipped the letter into my pocket and closed the book. The sound of it was louder than it should have been, like the punctuation of a secret unwillingly revealed. We lingered a while among the shelves. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the windows, turning the panes into blurred panes of memory. A student at one of the desks glanced up, irritated by our intrusion, then buried himself again in some medieval treatise. The library clock hummed just above audibility, marking a kind of internal rhythm that felt almost human. Lewis asked if I believed it was blackmail. I said perhaps, but blackmail usually leaves an uglier scent. This smelled of fear and affection in equal measure. On the way out, I noticed a small irregularity on the loans ledger. Julia's name appeared 3 times in the month before her death, all for poetry volumes, Donne, Hardy, and a slim anthology of her own department's publication. Beneath Hardy's entry, a faint correction, as though another name had been erased and rewritten. The pen had pressed too hard. The ghost of the original initial was still visible as an E, or possibly an F. I traced it absently with my finger and thought of Eleanor Briggs. The bursar's eyes earlier had carried the stillness of someone who has practiced composure too long. That night I unfolded the letter again at my desk. The script shimmered faintly in the lamplight, the ink having spread like a bruise through the paper. I tried reading it aloud, half a whisper. The phrasing was odd, almost literary, as if the writer had disguised a confession as verse. One line struck me. Our understanding must remain in shadow, as the truth is too bright to bear. It sounded rehearsed, too poised for spontaneity. I imagined Julia reading those words, weighing love against integrity, perhaps realizing that the two are rarely compatible within college walls. I placed the letter beside my crossword, where I had been stuck all week on a single clue hidden in verse, the silent truth, 7. I stared at it until the answer arrived, quiet and inevitable. Covered. It was both the word I needed and the thing I feared. For what Oxford does best, I thought, is cover. Its sins, its griefs, its clever little crimes all pressed neatly between the pages of learning, waiting for someone foolish enough to read them twice. It is a curious thing, how deceit announces itself not through absence, but through excess. Too many details, too careful an arrangement. Julia Fenwick's office was meticulous, almost devotional, as though she feared the chaos that honesty might invite. Lewis stood by the window, watching rain drag itself down the glass, while I turned the pages of her lecture notes. The handwriting was clear, deliberate, but every few lines a correction appeared. A word swapped for another, an adjective reined in. Precision disguises anxiety, the inked equivalent of a trembling hand. Her final lecture had been titled, "In the Bleak Midwinter, the Morality of Silence." I remember the phrase because it stayed with me, that curious balance between virtue and retreat. Among her papers, I found a quotation from Hardy. Except it wasn't. She had attributed it to him, yes, and even placed it in quotation marks, but when I looked it up later that evening, it did not exist in any edition of Hardy I owned. I spent nearly an hour with the complete poems open before me, comparing commas and cadences. The false line read, "They that conceal shall perish cold." An invention, but one that had been made deliberately, as if it carried meaning beyond its literary deceit. Lewis said I was overthinking it, that she had probably misremembered. Perhaps. But misquotation has always struck me as a moral act, not a grammatical one. It tells you what the speaker wishes were true. The rain had stopped when we left St. Bride's, leaving behind that peculiar Oxford hush-stone exhaling after confession. The porter was polishing the brass nameplates by the entrance. He said, unprompted, that Miss Fenwick had been kind to him, always leaving chocolates at Christmas. Guilt often arrives wrapped in generosity, I thought, but said nothing. Back at the station, I had Lewis fetch the typed version of Julia's lecture. The misquotation appeared there too, identical down to the punctuation, which meant it was not a slip of memory, but of intent. I tried to recall where I had seen the phrase before, something about concealment and frost. It teased me from the edge of memory like a half-solved crossword. That night I poured myself a small whiskey and sat by the fire with her notes again. The altered line began to behave like a riddle. Concealment, perishing, cold, 3 words that, when rearranged, told a different story. Cold, concealment. I remembered the caretaker's account of finding her body near the steps, half buried in snow, and the letter we'd discovered in the Dawn volume, an arrangement that must never reach the bursar's eyes. Secrets buried beneath ice. The pattern, faint as a watermark, began to reveal itself. I took out the newspaper clipping from the morning of her death. The article had included a quotation too, from Keats, this time the same one about beauty and truth. Only, again, something was missing. The comma, that small pulse of meaning. I began to suspect that whoever had tampered with Julia's lecture had also tampered with her obituary. It was an aesthetic choice, a signature disguised as error. The kind of thing only a mind steeped in literature would notice, or care to plant. Lewis rang just before midnight to say that Professor Avery had called. He wanted to know whether we had found anything new. I told Lewis to tell him nothing. The less clever men know, the safer they feel, and clever men at ease are prone to confession. When I finally closed the file, the room had grown colder. The fire had sunk into embers, the light unsteady. I caught my reflection in the window, a blurred figure surrounded by paper ghosts. I thought of Julia, of the false line she had written, and wondered whether it had been a warning rather than deceit. They that conceal shall perish cold. She had not merely quoted it, she had prophesied it. And somewhere in the city, I suspected, someone else was reading the same words, waiting to see if I would notice. There are evenings when Oxford seems to fold in upon itself, as though weary of its own brilliance. That night at St. Bride's was one of them, a dinner arranged hastily, under the pretext of convivial remembrance for Dr. Julia Fenwick. The invitation had arrived on thick paper, smelling faintly of dust and wine, and I had accepted, though I could not have said why. Perhaps I hoped that grief loosens tongues more effectively than interrogation. It often does. The senior common room was warm with candlelight and the scent of old wood. Portraits of forgotten dons stared down with that peculiar blend of irony and disdain, as if still unconvinced of posterity's judgment. Professor Avery presided at the head of the table, glass in hand, his eloquence sharpened by drink. He spoke of Julia with the careless generosity of a man polishing his own reflection. I wondered if he realized how often vanity masquerades as affection. Lewis sat beside me, uncomfortable in his collar, nodding at remarks he scarcely understood and cared for even less. The claret was older than any of us, and far more honest. It did its quiet work. Around the third glass, the conversation loosened, and Avery leaned toward me. She was due to publish something soon, he murmured. Dangerous, if one believed in that sort of thing. I asked what sort of thing he meant. He smiled, a little too long. Academic treachery, of course. She had found similarities between her own work and that of others less deserving of credit. The word plagiarism hung in the air, shapeless yet heavy, like incense in a chapel. When I pressed further, he shrugged. Best not to unearth old rivalries. The dead, after all, cannot sue. Eleanor Briggs across the table had been silent until then. Her hand trembled slightly as she poured more wine. She said Julia had been imaginative and prone to seeing conspiracies in the ordinary. A pity, she added, that imagination so rarely survives contact with reality. The others nodded, relieved by her composure. Only I noticed the drop of wine that had spilled onto the white cloth near her hand. She dabbed at it absently, but not before it left a faint scarlet trace. A stain too small to matter, perhaps, or too revealing to ignore. Later, when the plates had been cleared and the candles burned low, I found myself beside her by the window. The courtyard below was silvered with frost, the stone reflecting a dull, forgiving light. I said I had read Julia's notes, that her lecture contained a quotation that did not exist. Briggs turned slightly, her profile sharp against the glass. She asked whether I believed truth was always preferable to invention. I told her the truth had fewer defenders. She smiled, but her eyes had gone distant, the look of someone who had begun to measure the cost of silence. Lewis and I walked back through the cloisters in near darkness. He said it had been a waste of an evening. No one had confessed. No one had contradicted themselves. I told him confession is rarely spoken aloud. It lives in gestures, in the way a sentence halts just before the verb. He laughed, said I was chasing ghosts again, and perhaps I was. Yet one detail clung to me. When Avery had toasted Julia, he had lifted the wrong glass, the one Briggs had set down moments before. A trivial slip, easily missed, except that he had not corrected it. There had been a faint look of understanding between them, too brief to name, too practiced to ignore. Back in my room, I poured what remained of the claret into a tumbler and let the silence settle. It tasted faintly of iron, of old oak and something sadder, the kind of sadness that lingers in places built for thought but never for kindness. I opened my notebook and wrote 2 names again, Avery. Briggs. Between them, a thin red line. I left the glass half full on the table. The candle burned itself out before I did. The diary came to me not through diligence but accident, which is how most things of value arrive. A college secretary had found it in a box marked miscellaneous papers to be filed, though I have never known anything truly miscellaneous in Oxford. Every forgotten object here has a memory attached to it, as if the buildings themselves conspire to preserve guilt. It was bound in soft blue leather, the sort sold in stationers that pretend to be bookshops. The initials JF were stamped discreetly in the corner. The first entries were ordinary enough lecture notes, reminders to buy gloves, an unfinished crossword clue about truth concealed beneath frost. But then came December 5th. The handwriting was sharper there, urgent, as though the pen had grown impatient with civility. Q&E no, it began. But I cannot admit it. The proof lies beneath the snow. I read it 3 times. The letters Q and E could have stood for anyone, yet the mind insists on recognition. Quentin Avery, Eleanor Briggs, both too clever, too controlled, and both somehow tethered to Julia Fenwick's last hours. Lewis thought it circumstantial. He said the entry could have meant anything, a quarrel, a thesis dispute, even some romantic melodrama. But Oxford's quarrels are never merely personal. They are intellectual battles fought in Latin footnotes and sealed envelopes. We visited St. Bride's again that evening. The snow had returned, faintly luminous under the courtyard lamps. The air smelled of wet stone and something faintly metallic. I asked the caretaker whether he recalled anything unusual the night Julia died. He hesitated, looking at the ground. There had been a brief power cut, he said, around 9:15. Lasted only a few minutes. Funny thing, that. The clocks stopped but started again on their own. I asked if anyone had been seen outside during that time. Only a shape, he said, near the camera. I thought it was a student. I thanked him and slipped a £10 note into the donation box. Oxford's ghosts prefer small bribes. Later, in my flat, I laid the diary open beside the letter we had found in the Donny volume. Together they seemed to whisper a private conversation between fear and resignation. I poured a drink and stared at the line about the snow. Proof beneath the snow. It had the ring of something literal, not poetic. I thought of the steps by the Radcliffe camera, where she had fallen. Of the single glove, the stain, the way the frost had seemed to conceal more than it revealed. Lewis called to ask if I ever slept. I told him that sleep was an overrated indulgence for the innocent. He said it was impossible, then mentioned that the bursar had quietly ordered certain financial records removed from the archives. Old grants, he said. Research funds. Nothing relevant. He was wrong, of course. The irrelevant is where truth hides best. I returned to the diary once more. The final line of the entry struck me differently this time. The proof lies beneath the snow. Proof, not evidence. Julia had chosen her words carefully. She was a scholar of poetry, and scholars know that proof is a moral term before it becomes a legal one. Proof of betrayal. Proof of courage. Proof that she had been right to fear what she knew. Outside, the snow began again. Gentler now, the flakes drifting past the lamplight like pale confessions. I thought of Julia's hand as she wrote that last entry, aware perhaps that she was sealing her own fate. The pages that followed were blank and abrupt silence after the crescendo. I closed the book and placed it on the desk, the weight of it strangely human. For a moment, I imagined I heard her voice in the stillness, a quiet insistence that truth, like snow, falls softly but covers everything. We had him by mid-morning, Thomas Calder, the poet with the trembling hands and the doomed eloquence. Lewis thought it decisive, the sort of arrest that rounds off a case neatly enough for the evening papers. He looked almost relieved, as though guilt, once named, might vanish into formality. I envied him for that kind of faith. It is a luxury I have long mislaid. The evidence, such as it was, had arranged itself like lines in one of Calder's own verses, delicate, suggestive, deceitfully coherent. His fingerprints on the Hardy volume, his proximity to Julia Fenwick, his long, uneven history of obsession disguised as love. It all fitted too well, and that, I suppose, was the first crack. Real guilt never fits so cleanly. It stains unevenly, spreading where it is least convenient. Calder sat in the interview room with that same air of faint amusement he had worn at our first meeting. He didn't ask why he was there. When I mentioned the altered poem, "They that conceal shall perish cold," he nodded as if acknowledging a clever critic, not an accusation. He said it was Julia's line, not his, that she had borrowed it from an earlier draft of his own. She had liked the sound of it, he said. He smiled faintly then, the way people do when truth becomes more dangerous than lies. Lewis shifted in his chair, uneasy. He wanted a confession, and I wanted coherence. We both left unsatisfied. Back at the station, Strange congratulated me on a case wrapped before the weekend. He said, "Good work." I poured coffee instead of answering. The surface of the liquid trembled slightly as I set the cup down. A small earthquake of doubt. I've learned to trust such tremors more than evidence. They announce the places where meaning hides. That night I reviewed everything. Julia's diary, the letter from the library, the lecture notes, the bursary accounts. Each seemed to hum faintly with connection, though I could not yet hear the melody. I read Calder's statement again. The cadence of his sentences, the rhythm of denial. Something in the phrasing clung to me. He had said she borrowed it from an earlier draft of my own. Not a poem, not a manuscript, but my own. The possessive felt too proud, too deliberate, as though he wanted to be remembered not as a murderer, but as a source. Pride is rarely so tidy in the guilty. I walked to Radcliffe Square, unable to sleep. The air was brittle with frost, the city silent except for the far-off shuffle of some student returning late to reason. The camera loomed above like a thought too large to finish. I stood where Julia had fallen, imagining her last moment. The silence, the snow, the faint sound of bells dissolving into the cold. Calder might have loved her, yes. But love, in men like him, is merely the more refined shape of envy. Still, it was the simplest things that undid the illusion. Lewis, loyal to the end, had logged the evidence himself, and in doing so, noted the timestamp from the library entry, 9:23 p.m., the night Julia died. But the caretaker's outage lasted until 9:25. No one could have entered or exited during that time. The power had locked the electronic doors. The log, then, was written later, forged perhaps to suggest Calder's presence when he could not have been there. Someone had wanted him implicated, elegantly so, and who better than a poet to play the scapegoat in a story written by another hand? I remember standing there under the lamplight, watching frost reclaim the stones and realizing that certainty is its own form of blindness. We had solved the case too quickly, as though reason itself was impatient. I turned back toward the college, the faint echo of the bells following me down the street. False solutions, I thought, are like false quotations, convincing until you read them twice. Somewhere, hidden still, the real line waited to be spoken, quiet and precise, like guilt whispering its own author's name. The next morning brought no revelation, only that particular fatigue which follows false certainty. The arrest of Calder had satisfied everyone but me. I could still hear the hollow applause of conclusion in Stranger's voice, the paper rustle of relief. Yet something kept pressing against the edge of thought, a small imperfection in the pattern, like a single discordant note that lingers long after the music has ceased. I went back to St. Bride's alone. The snow had surrendered overnight to a grey thaw. Water dripped from the stone gargoyles like the city was slowly weeping. Inside the bursar's office, Eleanor Briggs was sorting through receipts, her fingers moving with the delicate precision of someone long practiced at concealment. She greeted me with the calm of a woman who believes she has already survived the worst. I told her I was returning Julia Fenwick's diary, that it belonged with the college archives. She thanked me politely, but her hand trembled as she reached for it, a tremor no larger than a comma. While she composed herself, I looked around the room. It was lined with ledger vast, bound things with their spines cracked and dusted in age. Money, of course, is the one narrative that never requires translation. Each figure, each signature, a sentence in a secret language. I asked whether she kept the research grants under her supervision. She said she did. I asked whether one could inspect them. A pause. The pause was enough. She motioned to a drawer, unlocked it, and produced a thin folder. Inside were transfer slips, typed letters, small memos bearing Julia's initials. I noticed at once the dissonance of the sums did not balance. Columns amended in a different hand, perhaps hurriedly, perhaps guiltily. I traced one entry with my finger, a payment to the Fenwick Poetry Fund, a fund that, as far as I knew, had never existed. I asked her about it. She said it was a clerical oversight. I asked again, softly. She said she could not recall. Memory, I have found, is a faculty of convenience. A clock ticked somewhere behind me, loud enough to measure her silence. I told her about the falsified Hardy quotation, about the diary entry, about the proof beneath the snow. Each detail landed like a quiet knock on a locked door. She stared at me for a long while before asking whether I intended to accuse her. I told her I rarely accuse. I prefer to listen. She smiled, then a small, sorrowful smile, the kind one gives before surrender. There had been discrepancies, she admitted. Yes, unapproved transfers between research accounts years ago before Julia's arrival. When Julia found out, she'd confronted her. But she had promised discretion, at least until the college audit. Briggs had believed the matter buried until Julia mentioned a poem, a private line about concealment and cold. Then, fear that art had become confession. She stood and went to the window. The courtyard below was wet and dark, the snow reduced to memory. She said that St. Bride's could not afford another scandal. Too many ghosts already, she murmured, too many reputations hanging by threads. Her voice was low, but I caught the fracture within it. I asked if Julia had threatened to expose her. Briggs didn't answer, only whispered something about how easily a person can slip on ice when the light is poor. I let the silence stand between us like glass. When I left, the The rain had begun again, soft, persistent, almost cleansing. I walked past the camera, past the spot where Julia had fallen, and thought of her line about truth buried beneath the snow. It struck me then that Briggs' confession, if that was what it was, had been less about guilt than weariness. A final act of arithmetic, one death to balance years of deceit. I stopped under the old lamp outside St. Mary's, the yellow light trembling in the puddles. It occurred to me that justice, like bookkeeping, depends entirely on who keeps the accounts. There are mornings when the world appears too clean to be trusted. The snow had retreated overnight, leaving behind the pallid gleam of stone and the thin smell of thaw. Oxford looked newly laundered, though one could still sense what had been buried beneath. I walked across Radcliffe Square with that familiar reluctance, the knowledge that what one finds at the end of a case is rarely justice, only a tidier form of truth. Beneath the north steps of the camera, the caretaker had discovered a sealed envelope. It had been half lodged beneath a loose flagstone preserved by the frost. The wax was cracked, but the paper was dry. Inside were the original bursary accounts and, folded with them, a page from Hardy's Poems of 1912-13, the genuine text of the line Julia had falsified. The ink was old, but her note, written faintly in the margin, was not. Let this be enough. It had the air of a benediction rather than a confession. Perhaps both. I carried the envelope to the college, though I already knew what it contained. Briggs was waiting in her office, her composure rearranged but not yet broken. I placed the papers on her desk. She looked at them without touching, her face unreadable, like a statue waiting for weather to erode it into expression. She asked whether I intended to prosecute. I said that was not my decision. She said it should be. A strange smile, then not of defiance, but relief. She told me she had written that false poem, not Julia. That she had altered the line to remind herself daily of her own concealment. They that conceal shall perish cold. I asked if Julia had known. She nodded once. The sound of that single motion filled the room. Outside, the courtyard was soaked, the flagstones reflecting the soft bruise of cloud. Briggs remained by the window after I left, her hand resting on the sill, fingers curled as though around a glass that no longer existed. I've often thought since then that she looked almost translucent in that light, as if the snow, melting, had taken her with it. Lewis met me by the gate, the evidence bag under his arm. He said quietly that Briggs had confessed in full the embezzlement, the alteration of the records, and the confrontation on the night of Julia's death. She had meant only to beg her silence, he said. The fall had been an accident. Perhaps it was. He asked whether I believed her. I told him belief was a luxury for theologians and journalists. He laughed, but there was little humor in it. We walked together as far as Broad Street. The bells of St. Mary's began their measured lament, that peculiar Oxford music of endurance. Lewis said something about justice, that it didn't feel like justice when everyone seemed diminished by it. I told him justice was like snow. It covers what's ugly but can't change what lies beneath. He didn't answer, and we parted without ceremony. That night I sat by the fire, the case file open beside my glass. The faint warmth from the whiskey did little to dull the cold that had settled somewhere inward. I looked again at Julia's note. Let this be enough. It struck me as the purest thing left in the whole affair, a plea not for forgiveness, but for rest. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet, tapping against the pane like hesitant fingers. I thought of her handwriting, of Briggs' trembling hand, of all the small gestures that had tried, in their flawed human way, to hold back consequence. When I finally extinguished the lamp, the room felt larger, emptier, as though something unseen had stepped quietly out of it. I remember thinking that Oxford, beneath its beauty, has always been a city of erasing each truth written over by the next, each sin absorbed by stone and time. The snow melts, and everything returns to silence. But silence, I've learned, remembers. I've always thought that the end of a case resembles the closing of a book one has read too often. You know each page, each line, yet still search for a sentence that was never there. The Fenwick affair ended as such quietly, without ceremony, like a candle forgotten after its flame had exhausted itself. Briggs was taken away with the dignity of those who believe their downfall a form of justice. The college resumed its term, and Oxford, in its usual indifference, continued to echo with the laughter of the living and the silence of the dead. It was some weeks later, after the thaw had fully surrendered to rain, that I found myself confined to a hospital bed. The diagnosis was minor, a heart more fatigued by years than by illness, though the nurses insisted on severity. I did not protest. The body, I've learned, often chooses its own moments to interrupt the mind. Lewis visited on the third day, his hands awkward around a bouquet that looked borrowed from someone else's intention. He said the newspapers had printed a retraction about Julia's death, a line correcting their earlier misquotation of Keats. I asked him to read it. He cleared his throat and obliged. Beauty is truth. Then he stopped. I waited, knowing what must follow. Truth, beauty, he finished hesitantly. I smiled. But that's not what Keats wrote, I told him. Or perhaps it is, depending on where one believes the truth begins. He looked at me, confused, a little exasperated, as he often was. He said that sometimes I made things harder than they needed to be. I told him things were hard long before I came along to notice them. He laughed then, softly, in that way he had when trying not to care too much. He left soon after, promising to return with a crossword from the Times. I believed him. He was a man who kept small promises. When the ward lights dimmed, I watched the ceiling dissolve into the shadowed rhythm of the heart monitor. Somewhere, a nurse whispered to another. The sound was distant, like rain heard through a chapel window. I thought again of Julia, of her falsified quotation, her letter, the note that read, "Let this be enough." I wondered whether she had meant it as resignation or peace. Perhaps both. The older I become, the less certain I am that those words are different. By morning, the rain had ceased, leaving a pale light across the sheets. I asked for my notebook. The nurse brought it reluctantly, as if it might tire me more than the illness itself. I wrote down 3 words: truth, beauty, concealment. They looked almost interchangeable on the page. I tried to recall the exact moment I first noticed the missing comma in the article, that small rebellious gap between meaning and interpretation. It had begun there, really. The whole investigation was born from a pause in punctuation. The irony did not escape me. In the end, it was not the sentence that mattered, but the breath between its halves. When I was discharged a week later, I walked home slowly through Broad Street. The sky was colorless, the air carrying that faint mineral scent of rain meeting stone. Students passed in clusters, their voices carrying fragments of laughter, arguments, flirtations, the eternal repetitions of youth. I envied them for their ignorance of how quickly joy corrodes into memory. Near the Radcliffe camera, I paused. The square was dry now, the last trace of winter erased. Yet I could still picture the place, where Julia had fallen, the outline faint but indelible in the mind's eye. I raised my hat slightly, a gesture to no one, then turned away. Back in my flat, I poured a small whiskey and sat by the window, the city spread out below like a palimpsest of secrets. The newspaper lay folded on the table. Beauty is truth. Truth, beauty. It read again, the comma restored at last. I traced it with my finger, that tiny mark of separation, and thought how even perfection requires a pause to survive. Outside, the bells began their evening toll, slow and deliberate, as though marking not time but understanding. And I realized, not for the first time, that the truest things we ever learn are those we can no longer explain. It has been months now since the case was closed, though I sometimes doubt whether cases of this kind ever close at all. They leave a residue faint, invisible, like dust on a well-handled book. One brushes it away, and yet the outline remains. Oxford in spring has its own deceitful clarity. The magnolias bloom, the quads are swept, the students laugh as if laughter were an inheritance. But beneath it all, the same river runs dark, silent, unwilling to reveal what it carries. I have walked often through Radcliffe Square these past weeks. The stones are warm again underfoot. The snow that once blanketed the city has long melted, though sometimes I still see it as a trick of memory, perhaps drifting lightly over the cobbles, softening everything except the mind. It was there, by the steps of the camera, that the world briefly stopped being reasonable. I used to believe reason could explain anything given enough persistence. I believe it less now. The truth, as Julia Fenwick discovered too late, is only one of several languages the heart refuses to learn. Lewis, ever faithful, thinks I've been brooding. He says I should take a holiday somewhere with sun and no libraries. I told him I wouldn't know what to do without the smell of paper and rain. He said I'd learn. Perhaps he's right. There's something about youth that insists on repair. I envy that. He has moved on, as people must. I have not. I never do. From my window this evening I can see the spire of St. Mary's catching the last of the light. The bells have begun their evening litany, slow and deliberate, like a patient heartbeat. I pour myself a measure of whiskey and let it rest untouched. It's strange how the ritual survives long after the need for comfort fades. I often think of Julia's final words. Let this be enough. It was a plea to the world, or perhaps to herself. Enough what? Enough truth, enough beauty, enough deceit. I shall never know, but I have come to suspect that understanding was never her goal. There are those who live by uncovering, and those who live by concealment. She was, tragically, both. I reread her last lecture last night. The misquotation still appears in my mind like a scar. They that conceal shall perish cold. She had written it as a prophecy, and it became an epitaph. The falsified line was not an error, it was courage in disguise. She had known what lay beneath the snow long before I did. I think she wanted to be found, but not rescued. There is a difference, though only the lonely recognize it. The college sent me a note last week. Polite, unsigned, grateful. They thanked me for my discretion, my diligence, and my refusal to sensationalize, the usual virtues of the uncomfortably curious. They did not mention Briggs. They did not need to. St. Bride's remains intact, its ghosts politely unacknowledged. The ledger is balanced, and the bursar's account is finally reconciled. And yet something of Julia lingers there, not in scandal or gossip, but in the quiet, in the pause before the page turns, in the air of the library when one forgets to breathe. Oxford keeps its dead gently, as though still waiting for them to graduate. I've tried, in my own clumsy way, to let go of this case. Each evening I tell myself I will think of something else. The crossword, the opera, the shape of a woman's voice on the telephone. But it returns. The smallest of clues, like that missing comma in Keats, demands attention. Beauty is truth. Truth beauty. Perhaps that is the closest we come to absolving a phrase too simple for the complexity it pretends to contain. Still, I find myself reciting it when the night grows long. I say it not because I believe it, but because it sounds like something one ought to believe. The city has gone quiet now. A few lights remain in college windows, scholars burning their futures into certainty. I envy their conviction. For me, the work has always ended in ambiguity. The dead do not argue, but they never entirely agree. I finish my drink and close the curtains. Somewhere outside, unseen, the first raindrops return to the stone. The snow has melted, but its silence endures.